Over on Jaguar Gator 8, a new college football video is out. In this video, we talk about a 1988 game involving San Diego State and Air Force, and how it kicked off on the same day, 3 hours after the San Diego Padres played a game at the same exact stadium. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. On November 17, 1968, the Cincinnati Bengals, in their very first year as a team, went into Miami and picked up their first road win in franchise history. After losing their first 4 games played away from Cincinnati, they finally got a win on the road when they went down to the Orange Bowl and defeated the Dolphins 38-21. It was an incredible day at the office for the expansion team. They outgained the Dolphins by nearly 100 yards. Their star running back, Paul Robinson, found the end zone 3 times. They recorded 6 sacks while never allowing any sacks of their own. And they came up clutch when it mattered most, outscoring the Dolphins 21-0 in the final quarter of action. After that game, considering the fact that it was the first road win ever for the team, Miami held a special place in the hearts of Bengals fans across the country. More than half a century later, and I'm fairly sure the city of Cincinnati hates Miami's very existence. Because ever since, the Bengals just cannot win games there. It doesn't matter how good the Bengals may be, or how bad the Dolphins may be. The Bengals are just cursed in that city, and any good luck they had from the first meeting back in 1968 is all but gone. Ever since the AFL-NFL merger in 1970, the teams have played 10 games in Miami, and the Dolphins have won 9 of them, with the lone exception coming in the regular season finale in 2007, in a completely meaningless game where the Dolphins finished the year 1-15. They met in the playoffs in 1973. The Dolphins won by 3 possessions. They met in 1978, and the Bengals got shut out. They met twice in the 2010s, and the Bengals lost both times in overtime, with one of those times in something you don't see every day, coming on a walk-off safety. Much like the Colts are seemingly cursed in Jacksonville, and like the Minnesota Twins are cursed at Yankee Stadium, the Bengals are cursed in Miami. And if you want an incident that exemplifies this curse more than anything else, look to when the two teams met in 1983 on Monday Night Football. Because during this game, the Bengals got completely screwed over by whoever was in charge of the Orange Bowl. We don't know whether it was the Dolphins doing, whether it was just one stadium official that went rogue, or was just completely incompetent at their job and didn't know any better, or what it was. But we do know this. If you're going to win a game on the road, especially against a very good team, led by one of the greatest head coaches of all time in Don Shula, and one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time in Dan Marino, you need to be able to see what you're doing. And on this night in 1983, the Bengals were not able to do that. Because this is the story behind the bizarre drama and what might just be the strangest controversy that might involve cheating in the history of Monday Night Football. Before I talk about the incident in question, we need some context to understand the importance of this game, as well as how Cincinnati's offense functioned heading into this game, because that's going to play a big part down the line. It's November 28, 1983. It's week 13 of the NFL season, and we have an AFC battle on our hands down at the Orange Bowl between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Miami Dolphins. Now, this was a Monday Night Football game in front of a national television audience on ABC, so that raised the stakes just by default. But even with that out of the question, this is an absolutely critical game for both teams. It was big for Miami, as they entered the week with a 1-game lead over the Buffalo Bills for first place in the AFC East. However, for the purposes of the story, we're just going to focus on the Bengals, because to say that they needed this one to keep their season alive would be a massive understatement. After 2 straight seasons where the Bengals were one of the best teams in football, making it to the playoffs and finishing with the best record amongst all the teams in the AFC Central both times, the 1983 season was looking like a massive letdown and disappointment. Through 12 games, as we were 3/4 of the way through the year, they were just 5-7, and were in serious danger of missing the playoffs. The good news for the Bengals was that despite their disappointing record, they still had a shot at the playoffs. Even though they were 5-7, the number 5 seed in the AFC as things stood was 7-6. So if they won this game, they'd only be 1 back with 3 to play. And while it would definitely be an uphill climb, it would be by no means impossible to go on a run. The bad news was that they had no room for error. If they lost this game and dropped to 5-8, you could officially stick a fork in them, as they would be done. However, what was weird about the Bengals with their 5-7 record was that from a point differential standpoint, they had the third highest one in the AFC. Their point differential was plus 53, which was higher than the Los Angeles Raiders, who were 9-3 and had the best record in the AFC. And one of the main reasons for that was their great offensive play, which is what you've been watching highlights of this whole time. Through 12 games, the Bengals scored 278 points, which ranked 4th in the entire AFC, only behind the Raiders, Seahawks, and Steelers. And even that number is a bit deceiving, because the Bengals started the season 0-3 on an offensive slump. After scoring just 23 points over their first 3 games, averaging just 7.6 points per game, they scored 255 in their last 9, coming out to an average of 28.3 points per game. Look away, Falcons fans. And after starting the season off 1-6, in their most recent 5 games entering this one, their offense was truly firing on all cylinders, scoring 170 points in that stretch for an average of 34 points per game. One of these outings was a commanding 55-14 win on the road at the Astrodome against the Houston Oilers. Anytime you're averaging 34 points per game in a 5-game stretch, you're clearly doing something right. And part of the reason why the Bengals were playing so well offensively was because of their play caller, Bruce Coslett, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Even though Coslett wasn't the offensive coordinator of the Bengals yet, as he was simply the wide receivers coach, he was the man responsible for calling all the plays. It was never supposed to be like this. Offensive coordinator Lindy Infante was supposed to be the man calling the plays. However, when Infante accepted the head coaching job with the Jacksonville Bulls of the rival United States Football League over the summer, Coslett assumed the play calling duties merely 3 days before training camp. At first, he had no idea what he was doing, as was to be expected. Coslett himself even said, quite frankly, to start the season, I was scrambling. I don't mind admitting that. The first couple of games in the preseason, I had no idea. It was rough, but it was something I had to go through. But by the middle of the season, he was starting to get into the swing of things, and had the Bengals riding into Miami on an incredibly high note offensively, saying, I feel comfortable about it now. I feel comfortable with the play calling. I'm learning to think a couple of plays ahead. It's something you don't know how to do under a stressful situation until you do it. Coslett was just starting to get comfortable and find his rhythm, and Cincinnati's offense was almost unstoppable now that he was getting into the swing of things. And he called all of his plays upstairs in the booth, just like a lot of offensive coordinators around the league. It allows for clearer communication, since there's a lot of stuff happening on the sidelines and a lot of chatter where signals could get misinterpreted. It allows for the coordinator to have a clearer view of the field, and it gives you an angle that you wouldn't be able to get by being at field level. It seems like the only thing that could stop Coslett at this point was if, I don't know, you restricted Coslett's vision to the point where he wouldn't be able to see anything, and was calling the game pretty much blind. Not that something like that would happen in a million years, right? Well, would I be doing a video on this game if that wasn't the case? Because what follows is either a case of incompetence or a case of cheating. And I'm not sure which one it is, but either way, it completely screwed the Bengals over in the process at the worst possible time. For the most part, this was a perfect night for a football game. When you've got a late November football game at nighttime, you expect the temperature to be in the 30s, and for you to be bundling up. Not in Miami, because when the game kicked off, it was 78 degrees, perfectly clear, and humidity was at 68%. If anything, it was actually a little warm for a game. And on a hot, humid night like this, if you know how moisture works and have a bit of a science background, you might be able to see the problem here, and you might be able to see where this one is going. Because after Coslett and the rest of his assistant coaches met in the locker room before the game, with head coach Forrest Gregg and the rest of his team, they went upstairs to the booth, where they'd be calling the plays for the game. Except when they got upstairs, the windows to the booth weren't really windows. They were sheets of white where you couldn't see anything. You see, for some reason, whether it was completely on accident, whether it was someone assuming that the weather for the game was not going to be as humid as it ended up being, or whether it was intentionally done by the Dolphins or stadium officials, The air conditioning unit in the booth where the Bengals coaches would be was turned all the way up. Combine the air conditioning in the booth with the humidity and the hot temperature outside, and you've got moisture. Lots and lots of moisture. The air conditioner cools the glass, and moisture forms, fogging up all the windows, which could not be opened. And this meant that Kozlik could not see anything that was happening on the field. Outside of one tiny square in the window, which was just about useless, there was zero visibility upstairs. For the record, the Dolphins did not have this problem. Their booth was working perfectly, and their windows were completely fine, acting as windows, where you could see the game through them. Obviously, you can't call a game if you can't see what's happening on the field. You have no idea what down and distance it is, what personnel the defense has out there, and no idea what the play clock is. It would just be a constant string of delay of game penalties. So with the visibility in the room awful, just seconds before the game was about to kick off, Kozlik had to retreat and rush down to the field and call the plays from there, with defensive assistant coach Dick LeBeau staying behind upstairs, with his job just being to monitor the weather and call down to Kozlik when the fog had cleared up. At this point, because you're not delaying the game over this, all the Bengals and Kozlik could do was wait on the visibility to be good again, and for the windows to not be fogged up anymore. But for the time being, Kozlik, who was just getting his feet wet as an offensive coordinator, had to call this game on the sidelines, which he was not familiar with and which he did not want to do. And the end result was that for that first quarter of the game, he was down on the sideline as he tried his best to call the offense. But over those 15 minutes, this was a far cry from the offense that was averaging 34 points per game over their last 5. Because in the 3 drives that Kozlik called on the field before the windows finally weren't fogged up and he could return upstairs, the Bengals looked inept. They looked more like the offense that had started off the season, where Kozlik admitted that he had no idea what he was doing, than they did the offense of the last month. On their 3 drives, they picked up just 33 yards, scoring 0 points, picking up 2 first downs, turning it over once, and never crossing midfield. The usually reliable Ken Anderson was struggling to get into a rhythm under Kozlik's makeshift offense. He was just 2 for 6 in that stretch, and one of those plays was a screen pass. The Bengals only had 2 plays that went longer than 5 yards. They had a run that lost 6 yards, and in total, they averaged a mere 2.75 yards per play in that quarter. To put into perspective how bad that is, here is a look at how the Bengals were doing from a yards per play standpoint in every game thus far in 1983. And when you look at the red bar at the far right, indicating their performance in the first quarter against the Dolphins with Kozlik having to call the plays from the field instead of in the booth like he planned for, it's like night and day. It's a full yard worse than their worst total, over 1.5 yards worse than every single total except for their Week 6 game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and it's not even half of what they averaged the previous week in their 38-10 win over the Houston Oilers. It truly was like a completely different team out there, which makes sense, seeing as Kozlik was having to call the first quarter from a completely different vantage point. By the time the windows were no longer fogged up and Kozlik could return upstairs to the booth, it was too late, as the Dolphins were already up 14-0. I don't think it's a coincidence that the moment that Kozlik returned to the booth, on literally the very first play, the Bengals scored an 80-yard touchdown on a pass by Ken Anderson to Isaac Curtis. Who knew that having an offensive coordinator that was actually able to see made a big difference? However, when all was said and done, Cincinnati's season was toast, as the Dolphins wound up winning it by a final score of 38-14, all but ending Cincinnati's chances at making it to the playoffs for the 3rd straight season. And to be fair to Kozlik, he did not blame the foggy windows on the loss, and he was not making excuses, saying as a good sport, if that was the problem tonight, then we'd be alright. They just beat our butts. That's all I can say. But it's not like the foggy windows helped them at all. It's almost like if I'm batting against Clayton Kershaw, and Kershaw decides to juice in the weeks leading up to my appearance against him, and he strikes me out. Sure, he got the better of me, and he was probably always going to get the better of me. I'm not hitting a pitch against Clayton Kershaw, but him taking steroids beforehand definitely did not improve my chances of actually being able to get a hit off of him. And from what I could tell, nothing ever came of this. There was no investigation done, no penalty issued to the Dolphins, No warning or league memo sent out, nothing. But this was how the Forrest Gregg tenure in Cincinnati came to an end. In 1981, it ended at the hands of a young quarterback who was an emerging star named Joe Montana. In 1982, it ended at the hands of a suffocating Jets defense that completely dominated the fourth quarter. And in 1983, it ended at the hands of fog that only impacted them and no one else. As for whether or not the Dolphins cheated, and whether it was intentional or just an unfortunate thing, I'll let you guys debate that. But what we do know is this: the facts regarding who is to blame are a little bit foggy. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.